Ismail,
welcome for being here. We had some very stiff competition for the weather, so it's very great to this session of IGUANA. It's called Why Does IGUANA Matter? Of course, we're going to explain what the project is all about and how it's going to help you with regard to resistance to change. I'm Fred Verboon, I work for ESHA. This is my colleague Joe Cullen, who works for Arcola. We are very pleased that you're here. We are going to show a demo of the tool and modules. We have an example of a pilot school in which we have implemented the IGUANA project. And then, of course, how it could work at your school and why it's relevant for you. And we would like to end with questions and answers. We are with 4 presenters today. Joe Cullen is the founder of Arcola Research. And we have Camilla Child, sitting over there. She's the principal consultant at the Tafelstock Institute of Human Relations. And we have Dr. Malcolm Kirsch, who's the principal consultant at Contour Educational Services. And I'd like to start with the introduction of why change is needed at school. And I found a really interesting video that you may like to see. This is a rather interesting slide, and I can understand that in the back of you may not be able to see it, so I just read it out loud. It says, when asked, would you rather work for change or just complain about it? And 81% of the people said they didn't know. It's a bit of a hard pick. So that really shows that about 80% of the people, and it really depends upon the topic, of course, we're talking about, really just don't like change. That's why we're all about. So from ESHA, because I represent ESHA, we strongly believe that addressing resistance to change is conditional to success. Because if you want to impose change, and instead of just help people change, we don't think that it will be a success in most democratic school systems that we know. So, and IGUANA helps reduce resistance to change. I'd like to give the word to my colleague Joe Cullen, who's talk about the IGUANA solution that we've built for you.
Thank you, Fred. So I think the way Fred phrased the problem that schools and their members are up against is all about pressure to change. And if you think of the school as an organisation, because of course it is an organisation, it's not just a school, it has organisational issues that it needs to manage. Schools are constantly being bombarded from the outside, from the external world, by things like technological changes. There's social changes, cultural changes coming in from outside. There's policy changes all of the time. There's economic changes, particularly in the current fiscal restraints. Internally, these have to be managed and accommodated within the school as an organisation. And at the same time, there are internal pressures to change within the school environment itself, things that students have to put up with and manage, bullying, performance targets that the school has to conform to, the ever-increasing drive to get better and better and to produce results that are almost impossible, the workload of teaching staff, management staff, all of these things are constantly boiling around inside the system. And the net result of that, we believe, is, well, schools will dig their heels in organisation, they resist change because it's difficult. The problem that we're addressing in IGUANA solutions we try to develop and test is this. We think that schools could develop and innovate more, change more positively and more effectively if they identify the patterns of behaviours, both individually and in the school as an organisation, that keep them stuck in the same cyclical pattern of resisting change. And we believe that these repetitive patterns and behaviours of resistance to change operate at two levels: individual members of the school, and as a result, when you add those individual behaviours together, you get organisation resistance at the school level itself. So IGUANA addresses those two issues: individual resistance or stuckness and organisational stuckness. And our definition of stuckness is this: a person, a family or a wider social system enmeshed in a problem in persistent and repeated and repetitive ways, despite the desire and effort to alter the situation. And in IGUANA, we're trying to work with the processes and obstacles to putting that desire into fruition. And this is really a little representation of what we call the cycle of stuckness, the way that the constant need and pressure on individual members of the school and on the school itself to do everything perfectly leads actually paradoxically to a cycle of self-defeating and self-repeating stuckness. If we could get it right all the time, everything would be okay, but we know it isn't. And it must be our fault. Therefore, we have to try harder, and we have to try so hard that we try to achieve the impossible. And that's impossible, and it makes us feel like we're even worse than we thought we were. So the whole damn thing goes on and on and on. So this is our theory. We think that schools will develop and change more effectively if they develop the emotional intelligence of their members, and that's all their members, but particularly teaching staff, management, governors. The idea is that if you can improve the emotional intelligence of individual members, then that combined will increase the school's capacity to innovate. This is Michael Gove, who until very recently was the UK Minister of Education, and this is what he said about the relationship between emotional intelligence and IQ, if you like. He said there are academically bright people who cannot teach, and other people who may not have been the most gifted at university, but who have the emotional intelligence and spark to really engage the classroom. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what I call the human and creative competences that are outside intellectual capabilities and enable and open up spaces for people to be able to surface and use their natural creativity. And that's what IGUANA is all about. So we define emotional intelligence in this way, a holistic way of looking at and engaging with the world. A continuous process of self-awareness and self-development. And we define organisational intelligence, the intelligence of the school as a collective, as this: the capacity to make sense of complex situations, apply this sense to effective action, develop, share and use knowledge, and to me, the key thing, to reflect and learn from experience. I guess the main objective of IGUANA is to develop these two sets of competencies: the emotional intelligence competence and organisational intelligence. And we're doing this by using three integrated components. The first component is an assessment tool. This enables schools to measure their current capacity of emotional intelligence and to measure their current capacity of organisational intelligence, and therefore to identify gaps in these two, which they can then work together and learn to make more effective. So the assessment tools are the starting point of the process. They enable the school to map where it is in relation to these two sets of competency. Then the second component is a learning programme which mirrors those self-assessment tools. So for every element of the self-assessment, we have learning content which enables the school and its individuals to fill the gaps. And the third component is a set of what we call development activities which enable schools to apply what they've learned to the real needs of their own organisation. So those three things together constitute the IGUANA, if you like, offer to schools. Self-assessment tools look like this. We have emotional intelligence tools. They're split into 4 competence areas. Each competence area has 3 competences. So there are 12, if you like, measures that an individual in the school and the school itself can use to measure what its emotional intelligence looks like at any one time. Equally, we have a set of 7 organisational intelligence competences that can measure where the school sits. So those are the tools. Using the results of the assessment, we can then help the school to deliver a learning programme, which the aim of which is to increase these sets of competences. And it's matched to each of the competence areas, and it's available online on the website. So if you look at the right-hand side, at the top, the self-assessment tools allow the schools to identify where the gaps are, and going down, there's content that is matched to those gaps. And in the third component, development activities, we realised that all change, as I've said, is hard, and schools need some support to help them use the tools, develop learning programmes, review them, and apply them to change. So we have a package of support activities that enable schools to use all these tools and all the content to fit their own circumstances and needs. So those are the 3 aspects. And all of this is available apart from the support activities which typically require our human face-to-face interaction. All of these things are available through the website. What I'm going to do now is to hand over to my colleagues to take you through a little slice of IGUANA and what it actually feels like to use these things in reality. So I'm going to firstly hand over to Malcolm to focus mainly on the emotional intelligence.
This is what you see on the website, and you'll be invited to click on one or either of these, and we're first of all going to go through emotional intelligence.
Thank you, John.
So, as Joe said before, we've identified 4 groups of emotional intelligence, and each group has 3 specific competencies, and we're going to now just look at one of them to illustrate the point. Thank you. So this is the group of 3 under affective competencies, and we're going to look at anxiety as an example. This is a graphic with a background script which you are going to hear and see in a minute, and you are able to follow the script in the graphic below. Thank you, Jack.
You all know alert, on edge, irritable, and unable to relax or concentrate. You may feel an overwhelming desire to seek the reassurance of others, to be weak or dependent. For some people, anxiety becomes so overwhelming that it takes over their lives. They may experience severe or very frequent panic attacks for no apparent reason, or have a persistent sense of anxiety. It becomes a habit, norm. There are many things you can do to reduce your anxiety to a more manageable level. Taking action may make you feel more anxious at first. Even thinking about anxiety can make it worse. A common and natural response to anxiety is to avoid what triggers the fear. But this does not make you less anxious as a person, and may also make it worse. Learning how to handle difficult situations and to assert yourself can make you feel more confident and therefore more relaxed.
So, after each of these graphic and brief descriptions of the competencies, you're invited to do the quiz, which we're going to give you an example of now. Also, you need to put your name in and an email address, and this can be confidential or it can be done via departments. We're going to go through some of these questions, and I'm going to ask Joe, who's over there, I don't know what he's going to say, but he's going to be our guinea pig rather than asking any of you to be the guinea pig. The first question, pounding heart. Do you feel a pounding heart? Never, almost never, sometimes, fairly often, or very often.
You mean right now? When people are looking at me? Fairly often. Yes.
Are you afraid or scared? Never, almost never, sometimes, very often, very often.
I'm very often afraid and scared, yes.
Do you have feelings of dizziness or unsteadiness? Again, which one of those?
Is that before I've had 10 pints or after? But I would go sometimes.
Fear of dying? Never, almost never, sometimes, very often, very often.
Almost never.
Periods of worry?
Very often.
Irritable or difficulty sleeping?
Yes, very often.
Avoid situations because of anxiety?
Yeah, very often.
Unable to relax?
Fairly often. For a bit of variance.
How nervous do you get?
I'm very nervous.
Trembling hands?
Yes, very often.
Would you like to leave a comment? Please tell us what you'd like to say.
No, I'm too scared to.
Please help.
Please help.
As a result of submitting the quiz, you get your score, which is a rather low score of 17 out of a total possibility of 50. And these are the same scores for each of the competencies. And in each case, you would then be able to investigate a learning process. There we are. So, in each case, we have this slide. Amongst many emotional intelligence competencies, there's a considerable overlap. So we're very often talking about similar processes going on, but the message is often the same. And where are we going? This is a brief introduction to the anxiety management. So the first slide would be this one, followed by a description of the slide. Then there will be another slide. Again, this could be done as a group, as a school, or individually. Each slide has an explanation of the slide immediately after it on the website. And then eventually you get to the further resources, which includes YouTube, other quotes, other tests, more extensive tests, books, all kinds of other resources that you might use if you were particularly interested in accessing and learning more about anxiety. Okay, hand over to Camilla, who's going to talk to you about organisations.
Okay, hello everybody. Yes, we worked also on organisational intelligence, which you might remember it's about sense making in your schools. And as Joe said, we consider all of your schools to be organisations, whether they're very small or very large, to do it incredibly well in different sizes. We developed this self-assessment tool, and we chose 7 areas that we think are really important in change, and Fred was talking about resistance to change. We are going to look at organisational well-being as an example of the kinds of things that we're talking about. And as with the emotional intelligence, they all begin with a graphic and, exactly Malcolm speaking, on text, and I think Joe's going to put it up.
When you enter an organisation, it's quite possible, after some orientation to it, to be able to take its temperature. But instead of this being in the usual way, it is expressed in how people behave, especially when they are working in teams or as part of a wider system. When people are working in an organisation where there is a lot of change to cope with, often the things they do become more extreme, and they can avoid the tasks that they are there to do, or they put all their efforts into certain aspects of their work. Sometimes they develop routines which help to distract them from feeling uncomfortable and anxious, but these can also stop learning and inhibit change. For example, members of the organisations sometimes unconsciously mirror the dysfunctional behaviour of their disruptive students in order to sabotage planned change. Here are some of the ways that organisations continue the cycle of stuckness. People are withdrawn, work alone, and stick to the rules. They feel thwarted in going forward and taking first steps. They are stuck before they even begin. Individuals are overly in touch with their feelings. Small issues get out of hand. Problems don't get solved. Blame and resentment simmer just below the surface. People overthink everything and hold lots of meetings without making decisions. People get stuck in making choices. They are hyper-aware of risk and thought. Intention and actions don't seem to be connected. The focus is on the task they have to get on with at the expense of any other aspects of the organisation. They do lots of efficient things but somehow miss the point.
Okay, I wonder if any of you recognise some of those aspects in your schools. Mr. Campbell, over there. Mr. Campbell, in your school, do people get easily distracted from the tasks they're trying to achieve and get very busy, seemingly doing what you might consider to be the wrong things?
Yes, people are always getting distracted and doing the wrong things. Yes, so I would say that was always.
Okay. Do staff members sometimes behave like disruptive students when changes happen?
When change comes along, yeah, some people don't want to employ change techniques. So actually, and they get quite upset when you want to change their behaviour. So I'd say it was often rather, because some people are are engaged with change.
And finally, one last question. People concentrate on doing things very efficiently. They're very driven by the tasks. But they focus on the curriculum, but there's not much about the other aspects of child and school development.
I think this is a conclusion from all the other questions, is that we get back to sticking to the curriculum, and we don't try new things, and people are afraid to try things. So I think this is often as well.
Okay. And do you have any other comments?
It'd be great if we could find some way to unlock this situation in our school.
And have the questions helped to stimulate any
I think if I was sitting around with people talking about these issues for the first time, that might stimulate the conversation within the school.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Campbell, the school needs help. The high score is 28. High scores suggest less healthy organisations. So this indicates that you might want to go to other modules, but you really possibly ought to go and look at the information that we've offered with some support on organisational well-being. And just to show the rest of you, have a quick look at it. So in this module, we start by asking some questions about the help you. Do you recognise your sport? Why might this be relevant for you? So you've come from the assessment, and then you're going to look and think further. A lot of these questions are about culture change and culture really is what we describe as how you do things around here. So if you do things around here that you might want to change, this might be where you look. So as we go and we look at leadership and different ideas around that, there's a very good article called Organisations Get Stuck Too, which is all about different types of stuckness that we kind of have a look at for this. So we're talking about culture and getting stuck, a bit more on that, about why it's difficult to change, and we talked about that this afternoon. Some of the theory ideas and a cycle of change that is very helpful to think about. Don't get too hung up on yourself a bit. Hang on, so now, so then you might, based on that assessment, you might want to think about what kind of school you typically work in, and then as we move through, it offers suggestions of how you change, and what the traps are, and what you might do. I think that's probably what I need to say. So you've got lots of characteristics, lots of help. There, I don't think there's a resources section on the end of this one. There's in the other one. It's another one, I think. And what we would really encourage is if you have your own resources that are quite similar or relevant, that they can be put onto this website as well. So anything that relates to the emotional intelligence and the organisational intelligence that you come across for sharing would be really brilliant for other schools, because this is about developing a platform for everybody to work on, which can be transnational.
Okay, so that was how it's used. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Alan for a very brief overview of what it feels like to actually do this thing in an actual school.
Going into the school, we went to a number of schools who were very interested in doing a pilot, and they were certainly very interested in clients. This school had an unusual group of teachers because it was a special needs establishment, and the staff had considerably different levels of skills, education and competencies right across the board. Some were very reluctant and resistant to it. Some were very scared of it and actually didn't even want to take part, particularly with the organisational intelligence, which they were very scared of. But once they started to do questionnaires and looking at the emotional intelligence to start with, it generated excitement. They actually started to talk to each other, get excited about it, laugh, and really get engaged quite considerably. It was quite difficult, maybe this is irrelevant, because it was quite difficult, and probably always is, to get everybody together at one time. So most of these quizzes can be done whenever it's convenient. They don't have to be done all at once, and they don't have to be done in one go. But once they did start doing it, once we started working as a group, they were really quite excited, and they really did start to engage. We chose to use the average scores and standard deviations from the average to make sense of the scores. This tells us what is the general profile of the school and its strengths and weaknesses in both emotional intelligence and organisational intelligence. on the basis of this profile, what development needs to take place, and whether a common development programme is required for the whole group, or a range of programmes that suits different profiles. These are the scores that we got from the UK pilot, and you can see the average scores for each of the competencies and the deviation from the averages. What you can notice with particular interest is, and not very surprisingly, is that under stress management there was particularly low average. And the standard deviation, though, was very broad, which obviously means that people were managing the stress in quite different ways and with hugely different levels of success. Conversely, with optimism and happiness, the average score was very high, which might be misleading, because actually the deviation was very high as well. And so there was a considerable range in the competency, this particular competency within the score. This is the scores for organisational intelligence. Groupishness has a very lowish score. And also the standard deviation, whilst higher than the others, it's not huge. And it would suggest that the organisation really does require, the school does require a lot of work in that area. So, in general, the mean average scores were lower for the organisational intelligence competencies than they were in the emotional intelligence scores. This indicates the need to focus on development in the organisation as a whole. And generally speaking, the standard deviation scores under the organisational intelligence were much higher. This indicates more varied scores and the need to set a different learning programme to cater for the different profiles. So it requires quite an engagement from the whole school. And then further workshops we go on to start to implement the learning plan we talked about before, the discovery programme, and to set assignments. So they were set individually, as a group, and with quite a lot of input from us. We reviewed, and we are reviewing still, and evaluating the results. And at some stage, we're going to redo the questions and to see how the learning and the workshops we've done has affected the scores.
Thank you all for your attention. And I'd like to start with the questions and answers from the audience. Does somebody have a question for the presenters?
Well, when I see this again, I think it's a very interesting program that would help schools to identify why there's so much resistance to change at the moment. You've seen the presentation this morning about the generation gaps about the change in the school. But my question is, there's a lot of data in it. And names, email addresses, schools. What do you do with data protection and what are these data used for? Because you're collecting, if lots of schools and individuals will do this, you're collecting a huge amount of data.
At the moment, all of the information has the capacity to be anonymised, so it's entirely up to the individual member of the school whether she or he wishes the data they have to be traced to them. Why we do that is we want to work, as I said at the beginning, in two main ways. principal, a teacher or maybe senior management can work with it on his or her own, do self-assessment, devise their own learning program, improve their competence. But we found that what increases dramatically the effectiveness of this learning is when the staff comes together and does it as a group, both the emotional intelligence test and the organizational intelligence. And so for that we need to some extent some degree of commitment and agreement from staff to use their data. Even having said that, it still doesn't mean to say that individual use of it can be identified. You know, if people do not wish that to happen, anonymity is guaranteed. But it did occur to me, because I'm working on a project using social media in emergency management, that there may be issues around schools having to register as data controllers in order to get information. That's something that has only come to my attention recently, so I think I need to have another look at what happens in that to be a bit clearer about what the actual legal requirements are.
And are there in how many schools are there in using of this tool? And have you got any feedback about results and which schools improved their working after that tool? And has it anything to do with cultures or countries where are schools coming? Because I'm sure it depends also on that. Thank you.
Yes, all those questions hit the right buttons. At the moment, we're working with 12 schools in 5 countries: UK, Ireland, Lithuania, Portugal, Greece, and this one. Also in the Netherlands, so it's 6 countries. And as you quite rightly have identified, that's a real spectrum of different cultures and what I call different learning systems. I think, in my opinion, at least, I think in the UK, recently, the coalition government, we've taken a retrospective step back to almost a position that Fred outlined at the beginning, which is now focusing on information and not actually in servicing the creative potential of teachers, managers, students. And I think that shows to some extent in the results. I think my colleagues have some views on how the culture affects different things. My experience was in Portugal and Ireland, and Sweden with very significant differences in how it still operates. We found, I think, that there's probably a more hierarchical structure, and I haven't offended me here, but there's probably a more hierarchical structure in some of Europe than what we see, for example, in the UK. But I think my overwhelming impression is that once, as Joe said, once staff are allowed the opportunity and an open space, we call it a holding environment. It's creating a protected space where whenever you say you're not afraid it's going to be held against you somewhere down the line. So my impression is that, yes, there are quite striking cultural differences in the different national systems, and yes, that does lead to differences in people's anxiety about getting involved, and it does lead to different openness, if you like. But we found that once people bought into the space, they actually really embraced it and swam in it, and it actually did. It did a real good job of sometimes, in some schools, for the first time, create an opportunity for people to critically reflect on why am I doing this? Why am I doing what I do? How can I get better? And what are the dynamics, of course, that are creating these things?
Can I also say that in the UK pilot, as I said earlier on, there was a great deal of interest in different schools. And going to each of the schools, there was a huge cultural difference from school to school within the UK. And it depended so much on the leadership and the heads' attitude and open-mindedness. So that within the UK, the difference was Thank you, Fred. Why have you adopted such a strange name, IGUANA? What is the symbolism behind that? Are you selling something in another box?
This is such a nice lovely animal which actually is in danger of extinction, like squirrels.
Improving school governance and using action learning sets.
Oh,
Say again, once again.
Improving school governance using action learning sets.
Something like that.
Yeah, thank you. If you could just say something about what sort of support can schools have who wishes to go into the project? Is it so well explained that it is sort of self-instructional, or do you provide support if someone wants to get on? And question number 2, what would be the good step 1, step 2, step 3 for people to start? And does someone start with a leading group and then take it with the whole school, or do you have any thoughts about that?
How to get involved? First point, email Fred.
yeah.
And then we can get you going, and it would be along the lines of seeing who we would go to talk to and how you would start to establish the group that I just mentioned.
Yeah, just as that. What we have is a handbook, piloting handbook, and it's got explicit instructions about how you do this. Then we go to the school, and participate, and then we work with the school using the handbook to set it up. What we're now working on is to expand and make that better. So we'll work on doing an online webinar that will provide additional training for how you implement this things in the school. And that's the next thing.
I'd like to thank you for your attention this afternoon. Please take a business card of mine, which you can find next to the entrance doors, and just send me an email and send you all the information you need. Should you be curious about using the tools, all the tools in course are entirely free of any charge, so you can start using them. Just be curious. You can find the links on our website at esha.org and our in the community portal. Just click on the community portal, esha.org, or just send me an email and I'll send you the exact addresses. Thank you very much for your attention. And,